Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Paul Garnett. I'm a agricultural land use planning officer with DPI Agriculture. Thank you for joining us today on this webinar to discuss the preliminary draft state significant agricultural land map. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we meet today. I'm presenting from Yagal country, and I wish to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. And I also like to extend those respects to any First Nations people attending this webinar today. We have close to 100 people online today. So if you could please keep your microphones on mute. During the presentations, if you have any questions, please post them in the chat function, which is at the bottom of the page. And we'll work through those questions in the question session at the end. We may be able to invite you to come off mute and discuss the questions, but please be mindful that with so many people on the call, we need to keep discussion succinct so everybody can have a say. If we don't get to any questions today, in the time we have, then we'll provide answers to them and put them in our frequently asked questions section on our exhibition page. We'll also make the presentation slides available on the exhibition page after the second webinar tomorrow. And it would be great if you can make your name and organisation appear up at your video, and you can do this by hovering over the video, clicking on the three dots and renaming yourself and your organisation. Today's webinar will provide you with a background information on the preparation of the preliminary draft state significant agricultural land map. The intention is to give you a better understanding of the process used to create the map and its potential use to inform any submission you want to make on the map. DPI Agriculture's Manager of Agricultural Land Use Planning, Tamara Prentice, will speak about the background of the preparation of the map, how it came about, and how it might be used in future. And then DPI Agriculture's Agricultural Land Use Planning Officer, Helen will speak about what the map shows, the criteria used to develop it, the feedback we're seeking, and how to make a submission. I'll now invite Tamara Prentice, Manager Agricultural Land Use Planning at DPI, to speak.
Hi everyone, my name is Tamara Prentice and I'm the Manager of the Agricultural Land Use Planning team, as Paul just mentioned. Thank you, Paul. And I'm very proud to be here talking to you all about a map. As most of you will know, a map has been something that we have contemplated for agricultural land in the planning framework for quite a number of years. I'd just like to start by talking about the planning framework more generally. So we can see across the planning framework that there's differing levels of maturity responding to the relative pressures that each of the sector has faced over time. For example, in residential and commercial areas, extensive planning has been undertaken to identify locations for high density development in comparison to in the rural areas where they've been subject to less relative pressure, and we've seen that there's often incompatible uses clustered within rural zones which have been applied inconsistently often across the state. In response to this, what we're seeing is an increasing level of land use conflict, and that's causing financial and emotional hardship on some of the residents, and also increasing compliance burdens for council. Agriculture plays an important role in the stability and the growth of regional economies. It also supplies food and fibre to our cities, and particularly down around the Sydney region. We're looking at, we've seen recently a call out for fresh food deserts and the like because of the pressures pushing agriculture further from those city centres. Agricultural land also plays important roles, and depending on location in the state, they can provide green backdrops, heat sinks and tourism locations. But what has been found during a recent process by the New South Wales Agriculture Commissioner was that more assertive and explicit planning was needed for agriculture to achieve regional growth and agricultural production targets. During this process, the consultation revealed that there was almost universal agreement on the need for a map. Agriculture continues to compete across the rural landscape and is finding itself under pressure from urban encroachment and land fragmentation as well. It's hoped that the map might assist to better inform decisions about the allocation of rural land. It's also hoped that the map might help educate the communities and decision makers about the relative importance of various sectors of agricultural land. We know that agricultural land is not all equal. Across 15-16, before the drought really took hold, we know that 17% of our land produced about 56% of agricultural value in the state. So it's between 6 and 7 times more productive that 17% of the state is. So the other 83%, produce 0.5% of that on a percentage basis. We've developed this map in the hope that we can enable a discussion in the first instance about what should be mapped and what that map might look like. We know that the map has come out in a very preliminary draft iteration. We understand that there's issues in some of the data sets underpinning it, and we're really hoping to get some feedback from yourselves through this process to try and help us better prepare this map. The next question that we're getting frequently is, how will the map be used? And there's really no easy answer to this question at this stage. So the Agriculture Commissioner made some recommendations about how a policy could be implemented, which would help implementation of the map. At this stage, the government has not had a chance to consider its response, and a whole of government response will have to be prepared across agencies as well to see how the map should be used. Those negotiations will continue over the next few months. And so at this point in time, the map as it's exhibited is not proposed to be used in any particular manner. What we do know, or what we are proposing at least, is that the map's not going to be used as a replacement for BSAL in the mining ZEP. That map was produced for a particular purpose. This map is being produced for a different purpose. So it's not proposed to replace that map at this stage. It's also not proposed to replace important farmland mapping on the North Coast. So the Agriculture Commissioner's report, some of you might have read, highlighted that was probably one of the better ways that we could implement this map over time once we had more confidence in it. But until that happens, we're not proposing that those maps be replaced at this point. The map may also need to be supplemented by work to identify locally or regionally significant farmland. So we know that certain regions have particular attributes that need to be called out, and this map certainly shouldn't prevent that occurring. It's just to try and help provide consistency across the state as to where our most productive land in the state should be. And I think that's about it from me. Paul, were there any immediate questions, or shall I hand over to yourself or Helen?
No, thanks, Tamara. We don't have any questions in the chat at this stage. So Helen, if you'd like to speak on the construction of the map.
All right, thank you, Paul. I'll just wait till So how was the map prepared? The state significant ag land map, as Tamara mentioned earlier, is definitely in its early draft stage, and it's predominantly brought together by 3 groups of information. The first area is we're talking about land with certain biophysical attributes. So with such things such as water availability, soil and land capability, soil type, and slope. And we'll touch more on some of those details in the next slide. But basically, we're looking at characteristics that are known and that don't readily change. The next group of information that we're looking at are the irrigated areas across the state. So when we describe irrigated areas, that might be land that has only 1 or 2 irrigations throughout the year, or irrigation areas that heavily rely on it throughout the whole growing season. Irrigated lands produce a significantly large volume of produce per hectare compared to non-irrigated lands. So this is why we've sort of pulled it out and identified it on its own merit there, because a significant amount of infrastructure and investment from both government and obviously from a private industry has gone into this particular method of farming. We know that water licenses are traded, and so that the location of water licenses haven't actually been used to help identify the irrigation areas in this particular draft of the map. It may be something that we will look at later down the track. We've identified irrigation areas through the use of the Australian Collaborative Land Use Management Program data. So That's a national data set that looks at land use management across different times. So obviously, taking into consideration drought and other climatic instances that affect irrigation use, we've taken a 10-year snapshot of that. So from 2007 through to the 2017 data sets. The other group of information, as Tamara mentioned before, is the state and regionally significant farmland on the North Coast. So the Agriculture Commissioner report pulled this out and identified it as quite a rigorous and scientifically backed data set. So the Northern Rivers Farmland Project identified the North Coast mapping in this area in 2005, and then the Mid-North Coast mapping came through in 2008. So it is primarily based on biophysical characteristics as well, but it was had a lot more input from the farming communities and reference groups, and then it was tested and verified by soil scientists and industry leaders in that space. So they're the three sort of groups of information that we're using to help build the map at this stage. And just as Tamara mentioned, the North Coast farmland mapping has been used in the planning system or planning framework since 2005 and has been accepted by planning authorities in the community for some time. I'll just move. I'm just having just trying to, there we go. We'll move on to the next slide there. Before I dive into what we use to build the map, I just want to touch base on things that we didn't use or we've excluded from the development of the SSAL map. So naturally, we've excluded all national parks areas, state forests, wetlands, and land that has a slope higher than 18 degrees. And that was based off the steep and highly erodible lands data set from the NB RM map. We also want to identify that or promote that the areas mapped are just in the LEP zones that are permissible for agriculture. So we're looking at the rural use zones, so the primary production zone, rural landscape, primary production small lots, and the transition zone. We also have many councils that are currently conducting land use strategies at present, and so we know that a lot of agriculture is currently undertaken in the environmental management, environmental living zones, and we're just wanting to identify what was happening in those spaces as well. Deferred matters are also used in the North Coast because of the underlying important farmland mapping for the North Coast, and in the next version of the SSAL map, we will look at deferred matters across the rest of the state. So jumping into the variables that we looked at to help build the SSL map, the first one is the land and soil capability mapping. So this is a data set that pulls together the best available soils and natural resources mapping across New South Wales. So it provides a broad scale regional view to the dominant land and soil capability, and it's built on 8 key soil and landscape limitations. So soil type, slope, landform position, acidity, salinity, drainage, rockiness, and climate. The land is then given a class ranging from 1 to 8, and 1 being the best land or land that has the less amount of limitations, right through to 8, which is predominantly the nature conservation areas, borders, and pretty much national parks areas. The next map layer that we were using to help build the criteria is the inherent soil fertility data layer. So this provides an estimate of the inherent fertility of the soils across New South Wales. So it's based on a 5-class system from low through to high, and it was derived from linking soil fertility to a particular soil type. We then used pH, and this was done at 2 different depths, so the 0 to 5 and 5 to 15 into that area. We also acknowledged that water availability is obviously, water is king in the agricultural world, and so we've used a a limit of 500 millimetres of rainfall or above, or lands that are within a certain distance to reliable surface water, being either regulated rivers or stream water greater than 5, and productive groundwater sources. So many of these layers were used to help build the B cell that was created back in 2012 or 13, I believe. And so we've just expanded on those criteria and data sets. And we also know that there's not a one size fits all across the whole state. So what we've done is we've ran a series of different scenarios where we use a variety of models to mix the criteria to identify the SSAL across the state. So for example, where rainfall was higher but soil fertility was lower, that would be identified as SSAL. Where soil fertility was higher but rainfall was less reliable, then yeah, you'd need a stronger soil fertility or soil type in that area. So that one there. We also just want to point out that the basis of this mapping is on the resources of the land and climate, the inherent characteristics of that land. It doesn't pick up land management. So we acknowledge that some biophysical characteristics such as soil pH can be managed to make the land more productive. However, management practices rely on the activities of that particular landowner, and should ownership change, then the land management might change. So yeah, that's why we're just looking at the inherent capabilities of the land that's there. Just gone away again. So while I've got everybody here, I might just walk through the exhibition page that we have here and just show you where you can provide feedback and what we're looking for. Just jump in here. So here we have the landing page for the exhibition page. So a bit more background as to why we're doing it and its development. Here we have, oh, sorry, scroll a bit far, the SSAL map, and we'll go into there in a minute. Here's an opportunity also to complete a survey to provide some more details about the map in general, rather than specific points on the map, and also to register for further updates on the project, because as we mentioned, this is just the first stage, and it will be a rolling development. So here are some documents that we will be, that are available. So a short summary on the methodology that outlines the criteria that I just mentioned, should you want to just go in and have a look at the data sets that are used. And also here is the report from the Agricultural Commissioner that outlines the recommendations. Down here, we also have a series of frequently asked questions that we encourage everyone to just jump in and have a look, and hopefully it might answer some other questions that you might have. Just come back here. So when we jump into the map itself, just greeted with a welcoming statement just here. You can see that you can grab the map, move it around, you can zoom in and out where you would like to have a look. But we want to emphasise that regardless of which level a map is viewed at, its precision is basically determined on the quality of the data used to create the map. So you might notice that some areas are more accurate than others, and this is predominantly because of the underlying data that was used. Some are more coarse than others. So the map at present is very broad scale, and it's designed to use for strategic planning purposes at the local or regional level. It's not suitable for property specific planning, such as assessment development proposals or spot rezoning. So that will require a greater level of accuracy. So in those areas where the data is less accurate, that's where we'd love to hear feedback from you. And that can be done in a variety of different ways. So if there's something that you like or dislike, simply grab an icon and put it down where you would like to make a comment. Fill in the comment about what you like or dislike, and further details there. And that's how you provide feedback on the map there. There's also, if you have any ideas or suggestions, or just a general comment as well. Should you want to just get the outline of how to do that, just click on the how to use map and it'll give you a step-by-step guide on how to do that. Over here, we also have a bit more information about the project if you wanting to get that background again while viewing the map. We also have the feedback activity. So where somebody's come in and made a comment, you can start a discussion, or you can like or dislike their comment. And you can also go straight to the survey here. So you can go straight to here and fill out the survey. So there's a variety of different ways that we can have a look at the map and provide feedback directly on the map there. I'll just close that one off. We'll go back to the presentation. So in this exhibition period at the moment, what sort of feedback are we after? We're looking to see if we've used the right criteria for the mapping. And if we haven't, what criteria is missing? We're also looking at, is there any other data sets that are out there that we have not used yet? So ideally we'd like to use statewide data sets. However, if there's data sets that are at the local or regional scale, then we'll certainly review those and see if we can incorporate them in the next version of the draft. If there's land that's not mapped as SSAL, but you think it should be, please let us know. But if you could please provide an explanation as to why it should be included. And conversely, if it's SSAL AML and it shouldn't be, please provide some commentary around that. So that's the sort of feedback that we're looking for in the development of the map. As Paul and Tamara mentioned, it's definitely at an early stage, but for something like this, it's important that we let people know that we're developing this project and we want to get community input and industry and government input right across. So I think that pretty much wraps up the map and how it was developed and the sort of feedback that we have. So I might hand back to Paul.
Thanks, Helen. Thank you both to Helen and Tamara. We've had a couple of questions being raised in the chat now. I'll direct a couple of these to both of you. Helen, Alex asked whether environmental zones, biodiversity and Aboriginal heritage will be protected. Could you just, I think you touched on it in your discussion, could you give us a quick rundown on how environmental zones were considered in the mapping?
Yeah, so we used environmental zones to just identify where some SSAL is in there because of those council areas that we're looking to rezone. But yeah, in the next draft, we exclude areas such as cultural and heritage and other areas that might come into environmental sensitive areas. Those sort of layers are already taken out. So they're not within the SSAL map.
Okay, thank you. Tamara, Robert Shelley has asked, the Agriculture Commission's report listed a sequence of events, first being, or revision of a map and a policy to go with it. You touched on possible policy when you're discussing the government response. Could you just elaborate on that question, please?
Yeah, sure. So the report by the New South Wales Ag Commissioner did sort of talk about the exhibition of a map and a policy at the same time so that we knew how it would be applied. It's proposed that any future policy will be exhibited. So this exhibition of the map is the first in what will be a series of iterations to try and refine the map. And so it is proposed that once there has been some cross-government agreement as to what that policy might look like, that it will then be exhibited in conjunction with the next iteration of the map, hopefully. At this point in time, we thought we wanted to start the process of the mapping iterations to try and make sure that the map got to the best possible format as quickly as possible. And so we thought it would be prudent to get the first version out on exhibition while those government negotiations took place in the background.
Okay, Helen, flood-prone land and mining leases. How has the map dealt with those two issues? Combining a couple of questions here, just because there's looks like we're going to start getting quite a few.
Yeah, so flood-prone areas have been still included in the SSAL because we know that some of the those areas are great for dairying lands and other key industries. So if the criteria match that and it's on flood-prone areas, then it's still included. In relation to mining lease areas, we haven't taken into consideration that in this stage, but the next draft will be including the any areas that's got development consent or disturbance footprint consent for mining areas. So that will happen in the next draft.
Thank you. And as Tamara pointed out, the intention of the map is not to replace the BCL map in the mining SEP. So yes,
and also to add on that also includes the critical industry clusters. So this map will not replace those.
Helen, Ian Sinclair suggested that the New South Wales Land Use Survey mapping may be helpful. Have we used that as a reference, or could we?
Yes, that's been looked at and incorporated to cross-reference some of the information that we've got. So we'll look a little bit deeper into the next draft of that, but it's certainly been a layer that we've used to cross-reference what we've currently mapped. So.
And where could people find further details of each of the criteria, such as slope, extent of rockiness, drainage characteristics, and things like that, that are in the biophysical characteristics of the land?
Yeah. So on the exhibition page there, under the document section, there's a summary statement that outlines the methodology that we've used so far. And in that document, there's a list of the data sets that we have used, and we've primarily used publicly available data that everyone has access to go in and have a look. And it has links to that. So there's the New South Wales data portal will have linked to the land and soil capability mapping. So if people go in there, then they can download that data layer and have a look at the levels of rockiness or acidity or the limitation that was used to determine that their particular land and soil capability.
Okay, thank you. What we might do is we'll keep going through the chat questions, but because we're getting quite a few, but if anyone would like to speak to their question, if you could raise your hand with the chat reactions down the bottom, and we might be able to talk through that, bearing in mind that it might take a little bit longer to get through all the questions if we're talking to them. But I'll go on with the next one. Tamara, in the North Coast area, the North Coast mapping is currently used to inform rezonings and around urban areas. Will this approach be continued with the use of the SSAL map? Should it be finalised?
Yeah, so thanks for the question, Natalie. The way that the map will be applied is yet to be determined, but DPI do provide guidance based on the best available information that we have. And on the North Coast, there's a lot of community support for the mapping as it currently stands. And so we think that it's reasonable to consider that even if the mapping, is correct at a regional scale and might have some edge effects, generally it provides us an indication of where the most productive lands are. And so we do use that to inform the responses that we make make to particular proposals. I don't think that this will change. I expect that we will continue to use the best available data sets to inform the responses, you know, that we make. And I'm hoping that answers the question and the intent behind it, Natalie.
Thanks, Tamara. Andrea Roundtree, would you like to come off mute and ask your question?
Yes, I was just wondering that if we already know that 15% of the land in the state is producing 85% of the agricultural produce, have those areas already, I mean, I know this is sort of trying to identify them, but we already know where a lot of those areas are. Have they already been marked off on the map?
Andre, I can have a go at answering that. Helen's an expert in it, but I'll have a go. We have an idea. So the 15% is made up of various types of industries that have contributed. So yourself, I think from memory, you're in intensive livestock. So that 15% doesn't actually include the intensive livestock, because that data set, the intensive livestock production systems are not necessarily reliant, in my understanding at least, and you know this better than I do, on particular soil characteristics. So the available data sets that we had at the time and still currently have are soil biophysical characteristics. So what we're proposing to do as an addendum to this process is identify what we're calling production areas. So those areas where there are clusters or known intensive livestock systems that we can then map as an addendum to this map. So the 15% that I spoke about picks up things like horticulture and viticulture and some of those cropping areas as well. Now, we don't know where all of them are, and some of them may be intermittent as well. You know, there might have been less area crop during the drought, for example, and some that are just used consistently because they've got access to more reliable water. So we've mapped as best as we can where we think that those that 15% is, but we're not 100% just because of the accuracy of some of the underlying data sets. Hence why we're hoping you guys will tell us where we're right and wrong as part of this process.
Oh, it would be good for intensive livestock because it isn't dependent exactly on the soil type and the rainfall, but we need the protection around it to grow the feed that goes in there, to not have conflict of land use. So I think it would be really good if they were not as an addendum but included straight away initially, because they're already there, they're already productive, and we do need protection from all those other land uses. So
yeah, there's another part of the process that we're doing, which is to identify buffer areas. And one of the recommendations in the report was that we make that a required consideration in the planning framework, so that there's mandatory consideration, not to say that the buffers have to be mandatorily applied, but at least they're a consideration. And what we're doing as part of that processing currently is just having a look at our interim buffer guidelines and just determining whether there is enough scientific rigor behind them, and how we can ensure that they are fit for purpose and pick up the industries that we need, and then providing an education program to councils as well as consultants and the community around, you know, why it's so critically important to have buffers around intensive livestock proposals. The issue with the map is we don't know yet how it's going to be used. So we could map the intensive livestock, so the ones that we know about, and again, look, based on what's happened in the past with you know, people having intensive livestock identified on a map and then having people come along and vigilantism against those proposals. It's a bit difficult sometimes to try and map things accurately.
We're already on a map, so don't locations are not secret already. But there are no reciprocal buffer distances. That's why we need to be on this map, because those buffer distances that people, you know, the DPI and various other government departments have been talking about them for years and years and years, and they just haven't happened. So please don't exclude us from this process, because we need to be part of it.
Yeah. All right. No, thank you. Look, we're going to do everything we can to try and make sure that there's less land use conflict. Like the trajectory of land use conflict was one of the key findings in this report, and coupled with that, like the mental and economic implications of that on the farmers and the community and the landowners adjacent. So we're going to do everything we can to try and help that land use conflict issue.
Thank you both for that question. couple of questions relating to land use planning and council's local strategic planning strategies and regional plans. Tamara, would you like to talk to how we are working with councils and DPIE to align with regional plan work being undertaken?
Yeah, so the intention is not that the map picks up land identifies as urban growth area bound, like within the existing urban growth area boundaries or for urban expansion. So if there are inconsistencies in our map with those areas that are earmarked for expansion, please let us know, and we'll make sure that we can rectify that. The intention, however, is to identify land which is of significance to the state in terms of agricultural production, in the hope that future iterations of LSPSs and regional plans direct growth where possible away from these areas. Now, that's not always going to be possible, and we get that. But where there is a possible alternative location, we would hope that this map would help in providing that guidance to say, this is really valuable land for this purpose. Perhaps you can do your expansion in another direction or look at density as an alternative. So yeah, we're hoping to get consistency with the regional plans as much as possible. The LSPS is a little bit more difficult. We don't have as much oversight of them, and there's quite a lot of them. So again, really happy to take your feedback if you do see council identified growth areas, mapped. Happy to consider what's being said in that space, and we also hope to be able to refine the map as the LSPSs are reviewed and the regional plans, look to what the LSPSs are saying as well as what this map is saying, and to try and get that harmony between predicted growth areas and proposed growth areas across the state, and meeting those regional, local and state needs for agricultural production.
Thanks, Tamara. Lorraine Wilson, you've got your hand up. Would you like to come off mute and ask your question? I think you might still be on mute, Lorraine. We can't hear you.
Okay. I come from the Central Coast Plateau, and Tamara, I was really surprised when I looked at the map the other day and discovered that there were a lot of areas on this plateau region that obviously had agriculture going on now, but were not signified with the SAL outline. And I take on board what you're saying about local governments needing to expand and subdivide. There would be little likelihood that our local council would want to extend subdivision areas out onto our plateau, because the cost of providing services out here would be astronomical. So it's not an area. The only thing that is happening here that is impacting is rural residential, where people with enough money are able to buy up previously agricultural land to put a horse or two on for teenage daughters and things like that. But we have a huge nursery, cut flower, beef production, chicken meat, stone fruit, avocado, and citrus industries here. And for a relatively small sub-region of the state, our productivity is quite large. So my question is in two parts, I guess. When you were mapping it, did you not have a look at what was actually there in front of you on the Google Maps, and not recognise improved pasture, for instance, areas? And I go back to what the other lady was saying. Obviously, a lot of chicken sheds, which you're not prepared, and I get it. We have been at the mercy of animal livers and things like that, but we also need to recognise where productivity is.
Yeah.
Can you answer that question anyway? Why you obviously did not mark where farming production was happening?
Yeah, and the reason is we don't have the resources to look at every single property and mark where production is occurring at that scale at this point in time. So this map is the very much a first pass. We've looked at the existing data sets that we've had and the land use, and Helen's just been through all of those, and we basically overlaid them. And then those areas that popped out as meeting the criteria were included, and those that weren't were not. And there was no team of 500 to go through and go, you know what, this is a really stupid outcome. We really need to fix that, because we just didn't have, one, the local knowledge, or secondly, the resources and time to be able to do it. So hence why this will be the first in what will be a series of exhibitions. And we desperately need that feedback from yourself, because there's going to be areas that we have mapped which are less than productive. I have 2 farms. One, a kangaroo wants a packed lunch, and the other one is amazing. You can't walk through there for the grass at the moment. Both are mapped. And like, we know that's because the underlying data sets are not great. And it's just a case of taking that local knowledge and saying, hey, look, this area is really important. There's an export terminal proposed in Newcastle Port. We're looking at a SAP which relies on agribusiness production. So we need protected productive areas within proximity to enable economic transport of the goods and the like, so that we can, when we are starting to look at a review of this map, say, hey, look, there's a heap more pressures on the coast, and we know that there are. And potentially, if we've got an extra bit of land that comes out here, maybe we could put that in there. Now, we can't map the whole of the state. The intention of this map is to say this part of the landscape is critical to agriculture. The other part of the landscape perhaps can serve alternate purpose like tourism and whatever else. But this part, we really want to protect so that we can intensify, not have land use conflict, and provide certainty. So we're very mindful that we want to keep it a very targeted map with a percentage or with an area of land map that we know, is of superior value, and also, we can provide those planning, well, I'd say protections, or that planning direction around this is the preferred future use for this land, and still enable other uses that are needed to occur elsewhere as well. So no, sorry, I've gone off track a little bit, but no, we didn't.
If I spread this map around to all the New South Wales farmers members up here and our Chamber of Commerce members, and alert people in the local little newsletter and say, for heaven's sake, go on there and make sure your place is mapped,
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And we need that, because we just, and I mean, and I'm not guaranteeing that comments will be taken on board. We might not make changes because we might not have the data to be able to support making that particular change. But if we don't have the information to say it's wrong, or it needs fixing, or it needs this to begin with, then we just can't even look at that. So very much, please share it around, get as much feedback to us as possible. We would love to hear it. When we're not precious, we're not thinking that this is perfect already by any stretch. Okay. So please.
Fantastic. and I have to be honest too, that a certain number of those landholders would be hoping to subdivide at some stage too.
Of course, yeah. Look, and in your region, there's a big push for rural residential. You've got urban people from Sydney coming out. There's one of the biggest problems across the state we're facing at the moment is rural res around your region. So, look, again, it's critical. You've got rural res, and people live there with an expectation of a rural residential lifestyle. And if someone puts a poultry farm, or there is an existing poultry farm next door, you know what? They smell. There's trucks. It's noisy, and that's what we're trying to prevent. So is that land use conflict? And please, any feedback that we can get in that respect.
But they like to eat chicken too.
And it's cheap. So, and it's cheap, so people buy it. That's right.
Thank you, Tamara.
I might just build on that, on following on that, is that another recommendation from the Agriculture Commissioner's report is to potentially look at industry production areas. So it might have been heard of IPAs. So that's a second mapping project that DPI are investigating. So that would pick up sort of key industries that might not fall under the biophysical map of that is SSAL at the moment. So.
Thanks, Helen. Just a couple of quick questions, Helen. I'll roll a few together from the chat again. There was a question about small areas of land being mapped. and being included on the map, as well as a question about some of the vineyards in the Hunter region not being mapped. Could you talk to those questions, please?
Yeah, sure. So the map that's being developed at the moment, yeah, we primarily just put in the criteria and determined what land popped up based on that criteria. When we do the next few iterations, we'll dissolve some of these small areas. So we have to then go in and decide whether they get incorporated or taken out, depending on the size of those small areas. So that's why there's a bit of a mottled effect in some places. In relation to the, say, vineyards or, for example, if you've got a blueberry farm or something, it depends on whether the criteria fit into that. So we haven't targeted this map based on a particular industry. So if an industry doesn't sort of fall within that, those biophysical characteristics that we're applying across the state, then it may have the possibility to be picked up in the IPA process that was a second recommendation from the Agricultural Commissioner's report. I do want to re-emphasise though, for the viticulture industries, around the Hunter area though, it does not cancel out the critical industry cluster there. So.
Thanks, Helen. Another couple of questions just before I go to you, Sam. There's a couple of questions in the chat about buffer distances and buffer guidance, broadly speaking. And now the Agriculture Commissioner's report did make a recommendation about DPI having a look at the issue of buffers, and that is a piece of work that DPI will be doing in parallel with this map. And just quickly, Tamara, there was a question about how the mapping aligns with the large-scale solar guidelines, current SSD developments for solar and wind projects. Would you quickly talk to that before we go to Sam?
Yep. So look, currently the large-scale solar guidelines that have been adopted by DPIA planning talk about avoiding land and soil capability classes 1 to 3 where possible. That's the only public guidance at the moment. Currently, there's no, as mentioned earlier, there's no policy in how this map will be applied or how it will influence particular development decisions or even the strategic planning framework. So at this point in time, the answer probably is, from a regulatory point of view, there's no nexus at this point between the map and where those proposals are going to go. Now, I'm not confident that that's going to be the position that's taken by the community. And particularly community sentiment is seeking, from what we're hearing at least, that prime agricultural land should necessarily or possibly be excluded where possible from coverage by solar farms and the like. But I mean, the issue that we have is that currently there is no policy about how this map will be applied, so we can't use the map to influence existing SSD applications. What I would say is that the map has been based on a criteria that's known, so existing map data sets that are known. And those map data sets are in the public arena and have been interpreted for production of this map, but also give a fair indication of land which is productive. Now, crudely, we've referred to land and soil capability classes 1 to 3, just for ease, and we'll probably will continue to do that so to some extent, but there will be a lot of consistency between land soil capability classes 1 to 3 and this map as well. So while the map in and of itself doesn't have a regulatory role, what I would suggest is that it does indicate where, at least on paper, some of the best agricultural lands in the state are, and that might then lead to some sort of community expectation that land might be considered for agricultural purposes as a high priority in relation to some of those applications. But I guess the short answer is there is no relationship at this point.
Thanks, Tamara. Sam Dempsey, would you like to come off mute and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. So of the 15% that's of a high yield for the agricultural and production industries, when we've looked at this 10-year period from 2007 to 2017, is there a filter that can be applied to look at the land use change just to capture where remnant forest has remained, where it's potentially been cleared, or to be able to, I guess, benchmark how the industry is positively contributing to land use change?
Thanks, Sam. So we are proposing a monitoring process once we can get this map finalised. But in terms of land use change, in terms of like the use of agricultural land, particularly, and conversion to plantation timber or some other type of carbon capture initiative, it's not proposed at this stage for this process to capture that. The monitoring process that we're proposing is to be able to understand how much of what we're identifying as SSAL might be lost in any year to agricultural production, whether that's through conversion to other permissible uses in the rural areas like mining or solar, or whether it's to urban encroachment and the like, and then understanding why that has occurred. Like we said, in some cases that might be necessary, but at this stage we're not proposing a process as part of this map, at least, to be able to quantify that land use management provisions. Having said that, it would be possible, looking at some of the data sets that OEH and EPA and the like use for the regulatory mapping. I think that it would be possible and probably worthwhile doing, but I have not got enough staff or mind capacity at this stage to contemplate that. But more than happy if you want to provide that feedback, because we're always looking at how we can improve the processes and the decision-making information that we have.
No, yeah, thank you. I just had a follow-up question. I understand that you're saying that down the line, you'd look to potentially include a second addendum to intensive livestock or looking at the IPAs. Do you know what the timeline to that would be?
I'd like to say yes, but I really am, I'm reluctant to commit. Like what it's going to depend upon. So I have a team of 7 staff, and we have a series of projects that have come out of the recommendations of the Ag Commissioner, as well as work that we do in terms of referrals and working with industry and the like. So the IPAs project, I love the IPAs project. It's one of my favourites, and I would love it to be occurring right now. But I just can't resource that while we're doing this project. And then the other thing is as well, I guess there's going to be some key learnings from this project and the mapping data sets that we have and the like, that will then inform the IPAs project. And also the negotiations across government too. So if a decision is made across government that this map has no regulatory effect, then the IPAs might not benefit from being identified in this process only. It may well be that we identify them and apply them on a regional scale, or we talk to council about their identification and then recognition in their LEPs at a regional scale. So there's a lot of uncertainties at the moment, just based on the uncertainty around this mapping process and how it's going to be applied. And I note that there is some frustration in some of the other questions in the chat around the policy and how the map's to be applied. And we're in sort of the same boat to some extent as well. Ideally we would have known and we would know by now what the map's intended to inform and how much weight it's going to have and the like. But irrespective, we think there's a lot of value in mapping what we consider state significant agricultural land, and we'll continue to run that process while that policy position is developed across government.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sam and Tamara. Kylie, if you could just put up that last slide again. I know we're getting close to the end of our time. Has anybody got a burning question they'd like to ask, or we can take a couple more from the chat? If you've got something that you'd like to raise your hand. One of the questions, Helen, from the chat related to identifying the criteria on the map, like whether at the moment when you look at the map, it just uses, it's just blue shading over the land, and there's no indication of why that land has been shaded, as alignment with the criteria that you spoke to earlier. Mm-hmm. Could you talk to that point, please? I noticed it was raised a couple of times. Sure.
The reason that we couldn't put up the data sets that's for the whole state with the underlying data that helped build it is too big, to be honest. It's close to over 2 gig, and so you wouldn't be able to move around or have a look on the map. If there's a particular area that you would like to get an understanding of what criteria has put it in or knocked it out of SSAL, please provide a comment or send something through to the email address, and we'll be able to provide some information after the exhibition period about the criteria that was used to determine it.
Thanks, Helen. So just to recap, public exhibition will be running until the 31st of January. I noticed also in the chat there was discussion about engagement with the agricultural industry. We will be holding another webinar in early January, conscious of the fact that a lot of farmers are busy with harvest at the moment and or struggling with floods. You can provide feedback by completing the survey or making a comment on the map, or providing written submissions by 31st of January to the SSAL feedback@DPI email address. And then once the exhibition's finished, we'll be trawling through the submissions and looking at any necessary amendments to the map. Noting that we are out of time, we will go through all the questions in the chat after this, and if anything we haven't covered, we'll put a response to it in our frequently asked questions section on our webpage, on exhibition page. And so I think unless there's any last burning questions that someone wants to raise their hand and speak to, we might close that webinar there. Sam, you still got your hand up, or is there anything else you wanted, or something new you wanted to talk to?
Oh no, I just left it up, but I just had a thought, just following Helen's point there. Like, is there a way just to apply like a filter to just show like one lens to the map? Like, you don't want to, I guess, have 6 different colors coming all up at once. At least if you could say, well, this is most applicable to me, this is what I'd like to see.
We can investigate the different layers that we can put in, but knowing that there's so many different criteria, it's hard to determine what different people may or may want to see themselves. So because it was built using a whole variety of different data sets, that yeah, it's just too large at this stage. So, but yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Sam. Thanks, Helen. Thank you all for attending today. Stay tuned on our exhibition page for updates and feedback. There's an area there where you can register for further information. And we already have a list of over 500 people, stakeholders, into the email addresses that we can send invitations out to, or more information out to. So yeah. We've had quite a few questions coming up in the chat, so we'll try and address some of them now. A question about slope, Helen, and the data set used to identify slope. Could you talk somewhat about where that information has come from?
Yeah, so the data set that we used was also, it's the same data set that was used for the native vegetation mapping. So it identifies land that's above 18 degrees slope. So we've only made a cutoff at 18 degrees at present. We also have a slope grid that goes right across the state, and we will be looking at potentially using a lower threshold in future if 18 degrees is deemed too high for this particular map.
So if there's land appearing that people think is steeper than 18 degrees, let us know in the submissions or on the map, and then we can investigate that. Another question about intensive industries. Tamara, would you like to tackle that one? Whether they've been accounted for in this process?
Yeah, no, and that's a great question. So, and it's something I probably should have mentioned in the earlier slide. So no, the intensive industries haven't been picked up in this mapping process. This process has been based purely on biophysical characteristics. there's an intention to map what we're calling intensive production areas, identified production areas, where we can look at where there are clusters of some type of development, or alternatively particular industries that need to be identified on a map, and have some type of level of consideration in the planning framework addition to this. So it was decided to split the two to enable further work to be done for those industries, as that enabled us to get the biophysical map out in an earlier stage, just to make sure that we had some level of consideration of the biophysical characteristics while we go through a process of working out how we're going to deal with those industries that are not soil reliant, like the intensive livestock and even some of the intensive cropping industries as well. So the Agriculture Commissioner's report that was released, it had 13 recommendations, and in those there's recommendations around education, the identified production areas I spoke about, but also buffers, and a consideration as to whether there should be a mandatory consideration of buffers in the planning framework when proposals are within proximity to existing agricultural enterprises as well. And so as part of that process, we are currently having a look at reviewing our interim buffer guidelines to try and give them a bit more scientific rigour and strength, and then try and raise their profile a little in the planning framework as well, as another way of stopping land use conflict.
Thanks, Tamara. And the information that was collected with the important agricultural land process between 2017 and 2019, could you talk how that's been considered in this map?
Yeah, so the information that was collected as part of that process looked at a couple of different facets. So it looked at some biophysical work, as well as collecting specific industry information for industries in those regions. So that industry specific information in the regions will be helpful for informing the identified production areas project, and some of the biophysical information that we've collected helped us determine what some of the methodologies settings might be as part of this process as well.
There's a question about the relationship between acid sulfate soils. We have been talking to other sections of government, other agencies of government that do a lot of work in the acid sulfate soil space, and we'll be working with them to make sure that our mapping correlates with what they know as well with acid sulfate soils. Sorry, go on.
Sorry, Paul. I'd just like to build on that one in that some of the low-lying areas are used as quite good dairying lands, and so where there's potential for acid sulfate soils, if it's not disturbed, then we will keep that as SSAL. And I also just noticed a comment in relation to the slope again. It's 18 degrees and 32%. So they're the same thing. So just clarifying that for those who were working between degrees and percent.
Thank you, Helen. That always confuses me, I'm afraid. There's a couple of questions relating to the relationship between mapped SSAL and urban areas. There's, in relation to existing urban areas, some of the SSAL butts that urban land and could be considered as an issue with land use conflict. Tamara, would you like to talk to that and maybe how the SSAL map could assist in resolving land use conflict in the future?
Yeah, so the intention with this map is to identify the resource and where it is. So it may well be that it does abut urban land in some places. I actually think I saw some questions as well about identified urban growth areas and whether it was intended that the map overlie that, and no, it's not. So if you do see any areas where we have included the mapping over identified urban growth areas, please let us know, because that's something that we can fix as part of the next iteration. But in terms of separation from existing urban growth areas, the issue will be if we separate the map from those growth areas and set it out a bit further, those growth areas, because it's intended potentially to be used in the strategic framework, those growth areas will then encroach to the boundary again. would then have to move the map back again, and then again they would encroach. So there's a risk of creep unless we actually identify the resource and where it is at the moment. Now, it may well be that there is land use conflict which would arise if there was a higher level of intensive production on the boundaries, and that would have to be dealt with at a site-specific level. But in terms of the actual resource, I think it's important to identify it where it is, not covering areas which have been identified for future urban release, but just to help guide where that future urban release might sit.
Thank you, Tamara. Question from Wallandilly Council relating to the economic viability of land. This is something that the Wallandilly Rural Lands Committee has been very strong in advocating for. Could you talk about how the viability of land might be considered or isn't considered at this stage in the SSAL map?
Yeah, so I assume that the viability of land is a reference to the scale of the lots, on how large some of them are. Yeah. So there's a whole heap of work being done in that space at the moment across various councils where my daughter's ringing my phone, across various councils where there's a whole heap of existing fragmentation, particularly in the coastal zones, and not mapping that land as SSAL would mean that land would again continue to be fragmented, whereas it might serve a useful purpose in facilitating some type of small lot intensive production. So whether it be, like obviously intensive livestock might not be suitable there, but it may well be suitable for share farming, some sort of emerging niche industry. There's a lot of emerging industries that don't require a lot of land, particularly in the outskirts of townships. So cut flowers, for example, mushroom farming and the like. Can occur on quite small lots. So I think there is an issue with economic viability, but often councils turn to diversification into other non-agricultural pursuits like tourism and the like within those landscapes, and that then in turn can prevent those lots actually being used, or adjacent to those lots being used, for intensive and agricultural purposes because of land use conflict reasons. So if you've got an existing fragmented landscape, please talk to us so we can work out what we can do to help you, or if there is anything that we can do to help you to try and make sure that the best agricultural land remains in sort of productive use, while also ensuring that that you've got the room that you need for growth and whatever else it is that the council might envisage as their future. Sorry, but the short answer is no consideration of economics or the exclusion of smaller existing lots at this stage.
Thank you, Tamara. Alison O'Brien, I think I saw your hand pop up. If people would like to speak to their questions, as Alison did, would you please click on the reaction button down the bottom and raise your hand, and we'll try and get to you as well. Alison, do you still want to talk to your question?
Yes, my question was regarding how does the SSAL land interact with the state significant renewable energy mapping that we're now in with Central West. I notice most of our area is state significant agricultural land, but we're now being inundated by renewables. How will that interact so that we can coexist? Thank you.
It's $1 million question, Alison. I'd happy if you've got an answer to that. Look, we met with some of the proponents of some solar developments yesterday that are both mapped as SSAL as well as being within the renewable energy zones. And at this stage, the purpose and application of the map has not yet been finalised. So there is no clear mandate as to how those proposals should be considered, and each at the moment is currently being considered on its individual merits. So I think we had a similar question in the webinar yesterday, and there's a regulatory aspect to it, which is that the map does not have at this stage a regulatory purpose in that space, but then there's a community sentiment purpose as well. And there's a fair bit of concern about social licence in the renewable energy zones, and the last thing that we need in those zones is loss of social licence because of a perception of loss of the sustainability of an industry due to fragmentation or the like. So look, it's a great question, and happy to talk to you more offline about that, because it's an area that we're working quite closely with planning in at the moment, and yeah, keen to try and get a resolution, because there are competing interests and it is driving divide at the moment across communities.
Thanks, Tamara. We'll go back to a couple of questions from the chat. There's a couple of questions relating to whether urban and industrial land has been excluded. It has, but the zoning has been taken as of June 2020, I think, Helen, from memory. Yes. So any land that's been rezoned as industrial or as urban or identified as an urban release area since then may still be showing up as being mapped as SSAL. So if there's areas out there in your council LGAs that you know have been identified for urban purposes since then, let us know and we'll look at that with the next version of the map. Another question relating to how this map will feed into the North Coast Regional Plan and also the review of the Greater Sydney Regional Plan as well. Tamara, would you like to talk to that issue?
Yeah, so there's a slight conflict of timing at the moment with the North Coast Regional Plan. So as I understand it, it's out on exhibition now, or is it, or about to go out on exhibition for review. And at this stage, our map obviously is in its first iteration, and very much keen to hear your feedback on how we can improve the map for the next iteration. But until this map is in a form where we're more happy that it's accurate, it won't be used to replace any mapping product. And then, so following on from that, the North Coast mapping will continue to use the existing North Coast important agricultural land mapping, important farmland mapping, until such time as this product is agreed to be a replacement for it and its accuracy has been, confirmed or at least accepted. So similarly with the Sydney, in the Sydney area, we did consider the use of the metropolitan rural area as potentially entirely being mapped, but we did note that it picked up areas that were used for urban areas and the like as well. So we determined not to do that just because it would impact the ability to apply certain planning controls across the breadth of SSAL. The intention is, as I mentioned earlier, any existing urban growth areas or areas identified for future growth purposes should be excluded from our map. So please, if they're wrong, please identify them. But yeah, hopefully it will be able to help better inform some of the planning in Sydney, though there's been quite extensive planning down in that region and particularly regionally specific planning as well. We know that there's issues with food deserts in Sydney, and even land that's not mapped as SSAL will be able to help contribute to that region's food and fibre needs, as well as demonstrating and educating the community, the broader community down there around agriculture.
Thanks, Tamara. Helen, a couple of questions about the functionality of the map. There was a point raised there that a comment made a little while ago hasn't shown up on a map, and also, do people get notified when their comments when they make a comment on the map?
Yeah, so we're getting quite a few comments come through, which is fantastic. That's the feedback that we're after. So they do get reviewed internally by DPI before they get put up on the map. So quite often, if they're more of a general statement about the map, then a feedback will go back via email to yourself and might not necessarily show up on the map, but you will certainly get notified for that. If it's a comment made on a particular area, so saying this area should or should not be included, that information goes up on the map for people to elaborate on or start a discussion or like or dislike. So it usually takes a few days to get through some of the comments, but definitely would get you will get feedback.
Thanks, Helen. One other comment or question related to the time frame for exhibition. Exhibition has been extended until the 31st of January next year, so there's still time to make submissions. Also, we've been informed of what with the harvest requirements and also with the flooding that we've had in Western New South Wales just recently. Many people who had registered haven't been able to make these webinars, so we will be holding another webinar in early January. We're penciled in the 13th of January. So the information on that one and registration details will go up on our exhibition page in the next week or so. So look out for that. If there's somebody you know who wanted to attend but hasn't been able to. Was there anybody else who wanted to raise their hand and speak to a question or any issues that are burning for them?
I might just raise mine quickly.
Yes, I did.
Yeah.
Oh.
Sorry, Helen.
I did too, actually, if you can hear me.
Amanda, yes, go ahead.
Yes, yeah.
So it takes a little while for your name and image to pop up to the top of the screen for us to see. So, yep, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. I'm disconcerted to hear that if farmers alter the pH of their land to make their land more productive, that is totally disregarded because the land might change hands. I mean, surely farmers should be encouraged in increasing the productivity of their land and also encouraged to dryland farm in a very productive way by planting deep-rooted legumes, no-till farming. There's a lot of things that farmers can do with dryland farming that makes their land productive, yet I can see that that land is not recognised as being of significant value. I can see on the map. And it's very significant.
Yeah. Tamara, would you like to answer that question?
Yeah, so thanks, Amanda. And look, I'm fully supportive of the use of regenerative or other farming methods which do make the land more productive. And look, it would be great if we could recognise that. So the map's intended to be at this stage applied at a regional scale. Some of the underlying data sets are very limited in terms of the input layers being at like 1 to 100,000 map scales at best. So to go down to a cadastral level and see how farming practices have improved the landscape in particular areas would probably not work in terms of some of those other underlying data sets that we're having to use as well. It also means that we would end up with a landscape where we might have a well-managed farm here and mapped and one here not mapped. But that's not to say that we don't encourage productive farming practices either. The mapping of the land as SSAL is not meant to mean that the other land is not as productive mapping land, farmland by any stretch of the imagination. There's certainly areas that are going to be used for dryland cropping which might not be mapped, and there's areas which at this stage may be mapped which potentially aren't productive at all. Also, if you do know of areas of the landscape where things have been improved, put a note down and we can have a look at that as well, because I mean it may well be that the underlying soil set isn't that bad. If it can readily be converted and made more productive, then it may well be that we have an opportunity to move things around a little bit and include that land at the expense of some other land which may be mapped and isn't quite as productive. So we'd really love to know from you where they are, but we just can't guarantee that we can look at a cadastral scale at each of the farms and say, look, this one has been managed well, and and even if it did change hands would still be productive probably for a decade or so before it did revert back to potentially what it might have been. So yeah, keen to hear where they are so we can see what we can do about that. But just in terms of the scale of the mapping at this point, we can't look at it at an individual site basis to do that. Maybe in some future iteration of it. The map's intended to be reviewed on an ongoing basis. We know that production methods change, there's climate change going on, there's obviously acidification and changes in rainfall patterns, which I think have been in some of the other questions that have been up there. And so there's an understanding that the map will need to be updated on a fairly regular basis as that information changes and better data becomes available. So, at some point there may well be a resource where we can map to a cadastral layer, and I hope that we do get to that point, because that would be really helpful from a planning point of view. But yeah, at this stage we just don't have the resource to do that.
Well, that's a shortcoming of the whole process, though, isn't it, really? Then if you can't, I mean, you're making decisions really about this land that may be incorrect.
Yeah, so that's the point of having the map applied at a regional scale to begin with, before it is recommended for any type of application at a DA scale, and it might never get to that point. So we recognise that there are those shortcomings in the mapping, but from the planning point of view and from the point of view of the consultation that we did with the broader community and with councils as well, we thought it would be better to have a product out there that might be 80% right to enable us to start a discussion as to whether there was a need in the planning framework to recognise agricultural land. We're seeing increasing amounts of agricultural land converted to other uses, and it's a case of, do we want to identify where we think the better agricultural land is, so we can, you know, ensure intergenerational productivity? Or do we say, look, we're never going to have the data sets to be able to have it identified on a cadastral basis, so we just won't do anything? And I think that the better outcome is to have a map which isn't perfect but could be made better over time, than to not have anything and not be able to influence the framework at all.
Thank you, Tamara. Katie McRobert from AFI has got the hand up. Katie, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you, Paul. A question that's probably slightly out of scope of this particular consultation process, but just wondering what the future consideration is for land that's adjacent to SL or BSL that might have beneficial services to that land. So I think Richard put a comment in the questions there about land that could be providing ecosystem services, like being an important biodiversity reservoir, or could be important for water management of that SL. Is there, I know it's not part of this particular map, but is there an intention to try and include those kind of adjacent services in future planning?
So I'm happy to take that one, and thanks for the question, Katie, and also for the question in the chat. Look, the intention, so the purpose of this map is to identify state significant agricultural land. Now, there's some levels or some areas in the rural landscape which serve multiple purposes, including environmental functions and whatever else the case may be. And you know, at some point they might be recognised. And I think this process, in my ideal world, and it might not be the view of government, we haven't had those negotiations yet, but would be to identify those areas which, you know, have a preferred future use for productive farming. And there's other areas of the landscape then which might be identified as having more of that rural landscape value, and they may be your environmental assets or an environmental management perspective. So I'm hoping that that this map is the first in a series of maps or a series of processes where we can ensure that the rural landscape is identified for its multitude of functions in a similar way to the way that the residential areas and the industrial areas are segregated into this type of residential or this type of industrial. It's you know, it's a clear area of work that needs to be done, and you know, and it would be great to be able to say this map's going to say this, you know, preferred future use here is enviro, here it's going to be landscape, here it's going to be primary production. We just haven't again got the resources to do that at this first pass, but certainly I hope that this is the start of a larger process to better allocate the rural landscape to those uses.
Thank you.
And I just and I might just jump back, sorry Amanda, one thing I didn't mention in response to your earlier question, and just to allay concerns, is that one of the proposals that we're looking at is that on a site specific basis, people can request a review of this map if they think their land has been mapped and it's impacting upon them, and they don't want their land mapped, or alternatively they want their land mapped. We're proposing to introduce a process, you know, once the map is finalised, where you can write to us and say, hey, I don't think the mapping's right. You know, I think you need to change it, and these are the reasons why. And we'll look at an individual basis at those requests and then update the map accordingly as necessary. So I'm not sure if that sort of adds to that, but I guess it's probably a bit of important information to have as well.
Yes, thanks. Sorry.
No.
Sorry, Helen.
Yeah, it's just building on what Tamara was saying. Yeah, a verification process will go ahead, which then will be reviewed by a team based on the input data that's supplied to help support it either being included or not included in the map.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Helen. Sally Whitelaw, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Look, it's just about the important farmland mappings in the North Coast when it was brought across to the new map. So it looks as though for around Coffs Harbour there might have been some changes. So just curious, it's a bit hard to tell with the scale, but curious if there have been changes underneath and what methodology those changes might have been made.
Mm-hmm. Helen, would you like to start on that one?
Yeah, so the North Coast farmland mapping was an input data layer that was brought in as a whole. Then there was also areas in the North Coast that were identified using the statewide criteria. So that might not necessarily be picked up in the farmland mapping. So the new areas that you're seeing is based on the criteria for the whole state. I hope that helps.
Okay. Tamara, there's a question in relation to the the future timeframes for further iterations of the map, and whether councils will be able to, or whether anybody will be able to provide further comment at a later date. Can you talk to that issue, please?
Yeah, definitely. So we're hoping to have the next iteration of the map out. We were hoping initially for April, May. So we'll still say that we're aiming for April or May for the next iteration. And we're hopeful that by then we will have a policy position that we can exhibit at the same time, so we can get feedback on both the map within the context of how it is proposed to potentially be applied. And there was some concern I also saw in the commentary about its application at a cadastral basis initially. Look, I just don't see that being its first application. I think we want to have a fair level of comfort at a regional basis before we apply it, mandatorily at a cadastral basis. So look, I'm not going to guarantee that's not going to happen, but I'm quite confident in that the map will be applied potentially in a strategic framework first, just to make sure councils are happy with that, and landowners as well. But definitely there's a proposal that will exhibit the policy and the map in sort of April, May next year as its next iteration.
Thank you, Tamara. Helen, a point was made in the comments about photogrammetry and multispectral imagery and the use of that type of technology to inform the map. I'm hoping that you can talk to those issues rather than, because I can't. Could you, give us a rundown of whether those type of things can be used, or how that fits into the publicly available data that we've used?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Those data sets are very useful for looking at picking up different land management and other criteria, definitely. It's a bit of a challenge to use them over a full statewide application. So currently we've just used the statewide information that's publicly available at this stage, because we know that there will be a verification process down the track. We've also just started this process with the preliminary map, and depending on the resources that we have available, we'll look at other data layers that we can fit in. But yeah, certainly if we can use some infrared and other satellite imagery, that would be fantastic to help with the accuracy, but it will depend on what resources we have available.
Thanks, Helen. And I think that issue of having the most up-to-date information, or building a map based on the information we have to hand, is also demonstrated in another comment in the chat there, that at the moment the best we've got is a 5 metre pixel rate raster for the slope lands, but there is a new we've got a 30 metre pixel raster for the slope lands, but there's a new 5 metre one coming out next year. So that's the type of information we're looking for in our submissions as well from other agencies, is where you have more or better information that can inform this map. We'd love to be able to use that so that we can make it as accurate as possible when it is finalised. Tamara, there was a question about cropping versus grazing in the chat there. A lot of the land looks like to be favouring the cropping land, whereas grazing can be occur on land that's not necessarily mapped on the map as SSAL. Would you like to talk to that issue, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's the reason that we've picked, or the reason that the map is currently covering cropping or land that is perceived to be able to promote cropping as opposed to grazing country, is that as you've pointed out in the question, grazing can occur for animals on a wide variety of soils and a wide variety of slopes. So cropping, however, is limited to only those areas which are suitable for cropping, fairly flat, fairly cleared, access to water and the like. So the intention is to identify land which is of state significance. So it provides an economic return to the state, some of our key export industries and the like, and then can be used for a variety of purposes as well. So I've got some country here that I'm looking out over at the moment that has been cropped in the past. At the moment, we're using it for fattening. At some point, we might turn it back into cropping land, but it's good enough that it could be used for both purposes. So look, grazing country is important, and certainly, you know, we've got a breeding enterprise as well that uses slopey land that wouldn't be any good for fattening. Also, we couldn't crop it. So while it's important to recognise that, you know, having breeding country is important to any cattle operation, it's also important that we identify the land that can be used for a multitude of uses, because if we identified all of the country, you know, across the state, or a larger proportion of it, we couldn't have targeted planning controls. And the intention behind the map is that we enable it to be used in the planning framework to have a stricter array of planning controls potentially, or at least a higher level of consideration for agriculture. And then there would be other areas of the rural landscape which are still considered agricultural lands, but may be able to do additional things, you know, which may be slightly incompatible than the higher intensity uses that might occur on the land that's mapped as SSAL. I know that's a long waffly answer to your question, but effectively it's about having, you know, quite a targeted subset, which is supported by those other lands as well. And as I've sort of said earlier, we're not walking away from the remainder of the rural landscape. It's critical, you know, as a nursery and whatever else it might be, whether it's for cattle or sheep or the like. We know fine grain wool is grown, you know, on some slopey country and poorer country, but we just can't identify all of the land. So we had to identify that land which could serve both purposes.
Thank you, Tamara. A question relating to notification of landowners. A lot of rural landowners don't have internet access, and so viewing the map will be difficult. We hadn't intended to write to all landowners in the state, which state government or DPI doesn't have that information, but we're quite happy for, you know, councils to or not to write to people, but to help spread the word if they have newsletters, and we can talk to individual landowners if they can't access the map that we have there. We've got about 4 minutes left of our time. Is there any other question that someone would like to speak to that we haven't covered yet? We've had a lot of questions there in the chat, and I've frantically been trying to cover them all, but I admit I probably missed a couple. Is there anything anybody would like to ask? Kirsty? Just have to come off mute, Kirsty. I can see your hand raised. That's it.
Sorry, clicked it, but it didn't take. Just wondering what the time frame is for including intensives and what the process is and how we get involved in that conversation.
So Kirsty, we're very much in early stages of that process at this stage, and we would really welcome any input that we can have to that when we get to a point where we can take feedback. Look, I envisage that process won't commence, you know, with any real vigour until probably 2023 at a guess, just because we're nearly in 2022 now, and it's going to take us, I suspect, most of next year to finalise this map. I have quite a small team, and we are working quite hard to try and get this map, as well as some of the other components, the education components and other components that are sort of recommended for us to undertake, done. So look, very keen to have input from anyone that wants to give it to us in relation to that process. So if you wanted to send us your details, Kirsty, we're happy to put you on a list. You know, we're going to have steering groups and project committees and the like for that project. So really keen if you want to be involved in that, that'd be great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsty. Thank you, Tamara. Kylie, could we just put up the feedback slide now, please?
I might just add quickly there, Paul, just to further build on some of the things Tamara has mentioned. This map is designed to look at the best of the best land, so it's not picking up particular industries. So I just want to emphasise that the critical industry clusters that are identified as part of the SAL, which is within the mining set, this will not replace that. So that's the viticulture CIC and the equine CIC.
Thanks, Helen. So just a reminder for the feedback, public exhibition is open to the 31st of January. As we mentioned, there'll be another webinar in early January. Keep an eye on the Social Pinpoint site for that. You can provide feedback by completing the survey or putting a comment on the map. The functionality of the map, being able to drop comments onto your particular parcel of land is really good. So while you're in there zooming around, having a look at it, give us your feedback on your land as well. And of course, we'll take written submissions until the 31st of January as well at the ssal_feedback@dpi email address. Once we have all those submissions and the exhibition period is closed, we'll work through them all. We'll look at all the data that we have and any new data that we can use to make the map better. And we will look at, Tamara said, looking at doing another version of the map for exhibition in April, May of next year. So if there's no other burning questions anybody has? I notice that it's 5 o'clock.
Paul, can I just add one more thing? Annie's just asked in the question about to what extent councils will have a say in the maps versus owners in broadacre areas, and both parties will have equivalent say. So if you could please provide any feedback, both councils and landowners have the same pathways to make comments to us on the map, and certainly we value the input of landowners because you know your country and you know what it takes to run it. So please, don't hold back, let us know what you think, and that way we can try and get the best product that's going to serve industry, which is what we're about, as much as being able to make sure there's a good planning outcome as well.
Thanks, Tamara. And then we'll be going through all the questions in the chat over the next couple of days, and as I said earlier, anything that we haven't addressed, we'll make sure it goes into the FAQs on our exhibition website. So with that, I thank you all for your attendance today, and we'll wrap up the webinar there. Thank you very much, everyone.